What if history had unfolded on a different, darker path? What if Imperial Japan had succeeded in building an atomic bomb before August 1945? While most people associate nuclear weapons exclusively with the Manhattan Project and the devastating bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, few realize that Japan itself pursued its own clandestine atomic program during World War II. Hidden behind layers of wartime secrecy, scientific ambition, and logistical chaos, Japan's nuclear research pushed forward under extraordinary pressure, yet ultimately crumbled before producing a weapon. This is the untold story of Japan's race against time to build the bomb, the brilliant scientists who led the effort, and the crushing reasons why they never succeeded. The dawn of the atomic age. The story doesn't begin in Tokyo or Kyoto, but rather in the laboratories of Berlin. In December 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann achieved something that would forever change the course of human history. They had been bombarding uranium with neutrons when they detected something unexpected: barium, an element much lighter than uranium. They immediately communicated their puzzling results to physicist Lise Meitner, who was then in exile in Sweden. Meitner, working with her nephew Otto Robert Frisch, correctly interpreted what had happened. They had witnessed nuclear fission, the splitting of the atom itself, and with it came the release of enormous amounts of energy. The implications rippled through the global scientific community like an earthquake. Physicists around the world immediately understood that this discovery opened the door to chain reactions, where one fission event could trigger others in a cascading effect. The military potential was staggering. If controlled, nuclear fission could power cities. If weaponized, it could level them. Japan was not scientifically isolated from these developments. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese physicists had maintained strong connections to European research institutions. Many of Japan's most talented scientists had studied in Germany, England, and Denmark, working alongside the pioneers of modern physics. They read the same journals, attended the same conferences, and corresponded with the same brilliant minds who were pushing the boundaries of quantum mechanics and nuclear physics. When the news of Hahn and Strassmann's discovery reached Japan in early 1939, it landed on fertile ground. Among those who grasped the significance immediately was Dr. Yoshio Nishina, a physicist who would become known as the father of nuclear physics in Japan. Born in 1890 in a village near Okayama, Nishina had followed an unconventional path to scientific greatness. He initially studied electrical engineering at Tokyo Imperial University, graduating in 1918, but found himself drawn to the deeper mysteries of physics rather than practical engineering applications. In 1921, he received an opportunity that would shape the rest of his career. Riken, Japan's Institute of Physical and Chemical Research, sent him to Europe to study at the cutting edge of physics research. Nishina's European journey took him first to the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, where he worked under Ernest Rutherford, one of the giants of nuclear physics. But it was his time in Copenhagen, working with Niels Bohr, that truly defined his scientific perspective. Bohr had won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1922 for his work on atomic structure, and his institute in Copenhagen had become the gathering place for the brightest minds in quantum mechanics. There, Nishina collaborated with Swedish physicist Oskar Klein on groundbreaking work in quantum electrodynamics, producing what became known as the Klein-Nishina formula, which described the scattering of photons by electrons. This work demonstrated that Nishina was not merely a competent researcher, but a world-class physicist capable of contributing to the fundamental understanding of nature. When Nishina returned to Japan in late 1928, he brought with him not only theoretical knowledge, but also a vision for building Japan's capacity in experimental physics. At Riken, he established his own laboratory in 1931, focusing on cosmic rays and particle accelerator development. His ambition was clear. He wanted to build a cyclotron, the revolutionary particle accelerator that Ernest Lawrence had recently invented at the University of California, Berkeley. These machines could accelerate particles to high energies, allowing physicists to probe the atomic nucleus and conduct experiments that were impossible with natural radioactive sources alone. In 1937, Nishina achieved something remarkable. He completed Japan's first cyclotron, making it only the second cyclotron ever built in the world, after Lawrence's original machine in Berkeley. The achievement demonstrated that Japan possessed not only theoretical sophistication, but also the technical and engineering capability to build complex experimental apparatus. Nishina even maintained correspondence with Lawrence himself, who assisted by helping arrange the purchase of an electromagnet from an American company. The two physicists, who had never met in person, developed a friendship built on mutual respect for each other's scientific achievements. By the time nuclear fission was discovered in 1938, Nishina was uniquely positioned to understand its implications for Japan. He recognized immediately that this wasn't just a fascinating scientific phenomenon, but potentially a source of revolutionary military power. Two programs, two visions, one divided effort. In the early summer of 1940, Yoshio Nishina found himself on a train, engaged in conversation with Lieutenant General Takeo Yasuda, director of the Army Aeronautical Department's Technical Research Institute. Yasuda was a former engineer with a keen interest in emerging technologies, and he had been following the international scientific literature on nuclear fission with growing fascination. During their conversation, Nishina explained the theoretical possibility of building weapons based on nuclear fission. The discussion would prove fateful. Intrigued by what he had heard, Yasuda commissioned a formal report on the feasibility of constructing an atomic weapon. The task fell to Tatsusaburo Suzuki, who completed his assessment in October 1940. Suzuki's conclusion was both exciting and sobering. Yes, an atomic bomb was theoretically possible, but even at this early stage, he identified uranium procurement as a critical challenge. Japan simply didn't have easy access to the raw materials needed for such a weapon. Nevertheless, the military leadership saw potential. In April 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army officially authorized Yoshio Nishina's laboratory at Riken to begin research into atomic weapons. The project was given the code name Nigo, with the Ni derived from Nishina's name. By this point, Nishina had a team of over 100 physicists working under his direction. The Nigo project would focus primarily on uranium enrichment, specifically on separating uranium-235, the rare isotope that could sustain a nuclear chain reaction, from the more common uranium-238. The method Nishina chose for this separation was thermal diffusion. The principle was elegant. Different isotopes of uranium would diffuse at slightly different rates when heated, allowing for gradual separation. To implement this, Nishina's team built what was called a Clusius tube, a vertical column in which uranium hexafluoride gas would be heated on one side and cooled on the other, creating convection currents that would theoretically separate the isotopes over time. It was a method that showed promise in small-scale laboratory experiments. But even as the Army program was getting underway, the Imperial Japanese Navy was pursuing its own separate investigation into nuclear weapons. This wasn't merely bureaucratic redundancy. It reflected a deeper problem in Japan's wartime structure. The Army and Navy operated almost as separate fiefdoms, with limited cooperation and frequent competition for resources and prestige. This rivalry would prove to be one of the many obstacles that hobbled Japan's atomic program. The Navy's interest in nuclear energy had actually begun even before the Army's. In 1941, Captain Yoji Ito of the Naval Technical Research Institution initiated a study on whether nuclear fission could serve as a power source for naval vessels. After consulting with Professor Sagani at Tokyo Imperial University, Ito's research showed that nuclear fission had potential not just as a power source, but as a weapon. This led to the formation of the Committee on Research in the Application of Nuclear Physics, which Nishina himself chaired, bringing together both Army and Navy interests. The committee met 10 times between July 1942 and March 1943. The committee's conclusions were deeply pessimistic. After the Japanese Navy's devastating defeat at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Captain Ito proposed a nuclear weapons program designated as B Research. However, by December 1942, the committee concluded that while an atomic bomb was feasible in principle, it would be extraordinarily difficult to build one in time to affect the outcome of the war. In fact, they believed that even the United States, with its superior industrial capacity, would struggle to produce such a weapon during wartime. With this discouraging assessment, the Navy largely lost interest and redirected its resources toward more immediately practical technologies like radar. But the Navy hadn't entirely given up on nuclear research. In 1943, a different naval command initiated a separate program, the FGO project, named with the F standing for fission. This program was headquartered at Kyoto Imperial University under the direction of Bunsaku Arakatsu, who was, next to Nishina, the most prominent nuclear physicist in Japan. Arakatsu's background paralleled Nishina's in many ways. Born in 1890, the same year as Nishina, Arakatsu had also studied abroad extensively in Europe during the 1920s. He had worked at the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge under Ernest Rutherford, and later in Berlin under Albert Einstein himself. In 1934, while working at Taihoku Imperial University in what is now Taiwan, Arakatsu had built a particle accelerator and performed the first atomic nucleus collision experiment in Asia. His research had revealed that each fission of a uranium-235 atom yields an average of 2.6 neutrons, a crucial piece of information for understanding chain reactions. By 1936, he had moved to Kyoto Imperial University, where he assembled a team of brilliant physicists. Remarkably, Arakatsu's team included Hideki Yukawa, a young theorist who would go on to become the first Japanese physicist to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1949 for his work on meson theory. The presence of such talent demonstrated that Japan's scientific capabilities were genuinely world-class. The FGO project took a different technical approach from NIGO. Rather than pursuing thermal diffusion, Arakatsu decided to focus on ultracentrifuge technology for uranium enrichment. The principle here was to spin uranium hexafluoride gas at extremely high speeds using centrifugal force to separate the slightly heavier uranium-238 from the lighter uranium-235. The design called for a centrifuge capable of spinning at 60,000 revolutions per minute, an engineering challenge of considerable difficulty. Early in the war, Commander Kitagawa, head of the Navy Research Institute's chemical section, had specifically requested that Arakatsu work on uranium-235 separation, but progress was agonizingly slow. The centrifuge design existed on paper, with detailed blueprints dated as late as March 1945, and documents have been found indicating that a centrifuge was scheduled for completion on August 19, 1945. Just 4 days after, Japan would announce its surrender, but the actual machinery was never built. The design phase was as far as the FGO project progressed before the war ended. The existence of two parallel programs, NIGO and FGO, pursuing different enrichment methods and competing for scarce resources, epitomized Japan's organizational dysfunction during the war. Unlike the highly centralized Manhattan Project in the United States, which brought together Army, Navy, and civilian scientific resources under unified leadership and with essentially unlimited funding, Japan's atomic effort remained fragmented and under-resourced throughout the war. The cruel mathematics of industrial capacity. To truly understand why Japan's atomic program failed, one must grasp the sheer scale of what the Manhattan Project accomplished in the United States. The American effort was not simply a scientific project, it was an industrial undertaking of unprecedented magnitude. Consider the numbers. The Manhattan Project cost roughly $28 billion in modern currency. It employed over 130,000 people at its peak. Entire cities were built from scratch to support the effort. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, became a sprawling complex of uranium enrichment facilities, consuming more electricity than most American cities of comparable size. The Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant alone used thousands of massive calutrons, arranged in racetracks to separate uranium isotopes one atom at a time. The process was so electricity intensive that the entire Tennessee Valley Authority power system was essentially placed at the Manhattan Project's disposal. At Hanford, Washington, enormous nuclear reactors were constructed along the Columbia River to produce plutonium, an alternative fissionable material that didn't exist in nature and had to be created through nuclear transmutation. The scale was staggering. Multiple reactors, each requiring enormous quantities of graphite as a moderator and cooling water from the river, operating around the clock. The Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico brought together the finest scientific minds from across America and allied nations, including refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe. Here, theoretical physics met practical engineering as scientists worked to understand the exact conditions needed for a nuclear explosion and to design bombs that would work reliably. All of this required not just brilliant scientists, but an industrial base capable of precision manufacturing on an enormous scale, abundant electrical power, access to rare materials, and most importantly, the luxury of operating without fear of enemy bombing raids, destroying facilities. Japan had none of these advantages. By the time the NIGO and EFGO projects were seriously underway in the early 1940s, Japan was already deeply committed to war in China and would soon be fighting across the Pacific. Every ounce of industrial capacity was being stretched to produce conventional weapons, aircraft, ships, ammunition, and the materials to sustain a far-flung empire under increasing pressure. The Japanese scientists understood the physics of fission, chain reactions, and isotope separation just as well as their American counterparts. Yoshio Nishina's Klein-Nishina formula was part of the theoretical foundation of quantum mechanics. Bunsaku Arakatsu had demonstrated his experimental prowess with particle accelerators. These were not second-rate researchers fumbling in the dark. They were world-class physicists who corresponded with Einstein, Bohr, and Rutherford. The knowledge was there. What Japan lacked was the industrial capacity to transform knowledge into weapons. Electricity provides perhaps the clearest example of this disparity. Nishina's thermal diffusion apparatus at Riken required substantial electrical power to maintain the temperature gradients needed for isotope separation. But Japan was experiencing chronic electricity shortages as the war intensified. Power had to be rationed for essential war production. The idea of dedicating massive amounts of electricity to an experimental program with uncertain payoff, when that same electricity could be powering factories producing desperately needed aircraft, was almost impossible to justify. Materials presented another insurmountable challenge. The Manhattan Project used thousands of tons of silver borrowed from the U.S. Treasury to make low-resistance electromagnets for the calutrons at Oak Ridge. Japan couldn't spare such quantities of precious metals. High-quality graphite needed as a moderator in reactor designs was difficult to produce in sufficient purity and quantity. Heavy water, an alternative moderator, was available only in tiny amounts from industrial facilities in Korea that produced it as a byproduct of fertilizer production. The organizational contrast was equally stark. In the United States, General Leslie Groves coordinated the entire Manhattan Project with military efficiency, cutting through bureaucratic obstacles and ensuring that whatever scientists needed, they received. Scientists from universities across the country were recruited and relocated to the main research sites. The best engineering firms in America contributed their expertise. The project had the full backing of President Roosevelt and later President Truman, with resources allocated as a top national priority. In Japan, scientists working on atomic research were competing with every other war program for attention and resources. The Army and Navy programs barely communicated with each other. There was no central coordination, no unified command structure, and no guarantee that discoveries made in one program would be shared with the other. When Nishina's team calculated what would be needed to produce enough enriched uranium for a bomb, the numbers were devastating. They estimated that approximately 10 kilograms of highly enriched uranium-235 would be required. Producing this quantity through thermal diffusion would demand industrial facilities on a scale that simply didn't exist in Japan and couldn't be built given wartime constraints. The tiny Clusius tube at Riken could separate uranium isotopes in principle, but scaling up to industrial production would require hundreds or thousands of such devices. Enormous quantities of uranium hexafluoride gas, constant electrical power, and years of continuous operation. The contrast with Oak Ridge is instructive. Even with America's massive industrial capacity, the electromagnetic separation calutrons operated for years and barely produced enough uranium-235 for a single bomb. The gaseous diffusion plant, using a different separation method, was even larger and more complex. Japan had neither the industrial infrastructure nor the time to build anything comparable. As the war progressed and Japan's position deteriorated, the gap only widened. American industrial production was ramping up to levels that dwarfed anything Japan could achieve. Meanwhile, Japan's cities and factories were increasingly vulnerable to American bombing, making long-term industrial projects even more difficult to sustain. The uranium hunt across Asia. If industrial capacity was Japan's first insurmountable obstacle, uranium procurement was its second. No matter how brilliant the scientists or how advanced the enrichment technology, without raw uranium ore, the entire enterprise was impossible. The Manhattan Project had the advantage of reliable uranium sources. The richest uranium deposits known at the time were in the Belgian Congo, controlled by the Belgian government in exile in London, which made the ore available to the Allies. Additional sources existed in Canada and the American Southwest. The United States and Britain could transport these materials across secure shipping routes without significant risk of interception. Japan faced a completely different situation. The home islands had virtually no uranium deposits of commercial significance. This meant that any uranium would have to come from occupied territories or neutral trading partners. The problem was that uranium ore wasn't particularly common anywhere, and the richest known deposits were either in Allied hands or inaccessible to Japan. Nevertheless, the Japanese military launched systematic searches across occupied Asia. Teams of geologists and mining engineers were dispatched to Korea, which had been under Japanese colonial control since 1910. They searched Manchuria, where Japan had established the puppet state of Manchukuo. They explored parts of China under Japanese occupation. Expeditions even reached as far as Burma and Mongolia, seeking any deposits that might be exploitable. The results were disappointing. While small uranium-bearing ore deposits were discovered in a few locations, the quality was generally poor and the quantities were limited. Mining and processing low-grade uranium ore is difficult and expensive even under ideal conditions. Under wartime conditions with limited equipment and expertise, it was nearly impossible to extract useful quantities. There are reports that the Navy program managed to acquire about 200 pounds of uranium oxide through the black market in Shanghai late in the war. But even if this material had been of high grade, which is doubtful, it was far from the amount needed for weapons production. The most intriguing aspect of Japan's uranium quest involves cooperation with Nazi Germany. Despite the vast geographic distance separating the two Axis powers, there were attempts at strategic collaboration on advanced weapons technology. Submarines became the primary means of transport for strategic materials and technical information between Germany and Japan after the Soviet Union entered the war and closed the Trans-Siberian Railway route. The most famous example of this submarine traffic was U-234, a German-type XB submarine that set sail from Kristiansand, Norway, on April 15, 1945, bound for Japan with a precious cargo. Among the 240 tons of material crammed into the submarine were technical drawings, components for jet aircraft, and most significantly 560 kilograms of uranium oxide packed in 10 lead-lined containers. The uranium oxide had reportedly been labeled U-235, though historians debate whether this referred to the isotope or simply to the submarine's designation. If Germany had indeed managed to enrich this uranium, it would have represented a significant breakthrough, but most scholars believe the label was misleading and that the uranium oxide was unenriched. Natural uranium, suitable perhaps for use as a catalyst in producing synthetic aviation fuel rather than for weapons. The submarine carried a diverse group of passengers, including Luftwaffe General Ulrich Kessler, several German scientists and engineers, and 2 Japanese naval officers. Lieutenant Commander Hideo Tomonaga, a naval architect and submarine designer, and Lieutenant Commander Shoji Genzo, an aviation expert. These men were supposed to help Japan exploit the advanced German technology being transported, but U-234 never reached Japan. On May 1, 1945, the submarine's crew received news of Hitler's suicide. On May 8th came the order that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The submarine's commander, Lieutenant Johann Fehler, faced an agonizing decision. Should he continue to Japan and deliver the cargo to Allies who were still at war, or should he surrender to the Allies? After consulting with his officers, Fehler decided to surrender, but not to the British forces in Canada. Instead, he made radio contact with American authorities and arranged to surrender to the United States. Before the surrender, the two Japanese officers, knowing what fate awaited them in American captivity, attempted to commit suicide by taking overdoses of luminol, a barbiturate sleeping pill. The attempt was botched, and they suffered for hours before the German crew, following the cold logic of preventing American interrogation, completed the act by throwing them overboard while still alive. On May 14, 1945, U-234 was intercepted by the USS Sutton south of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland and escorted to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire. There, American authorities discovered the uranium oxide cargo. The material was classified as highly secret, and its existence remained hidden from the public for decades, well into the Cold War. The exact fate of this uranium remains somewhat mysterious. Some historians believe it was shipped to Oak Ridge and added to the Manhattan Project's stockpile, possibly contributing to the material used in the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. However, even if this happened, the quantity was relatively small, amounting to about 3.5 kilograms of uranium, 235 after enrichment, roughly one-fifth of what was needed for a single bomb. More importantly, the timeline suggests the material arrived too late to be processed and incorporated into the bombs used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The U-234 incident highlighted the desperate lengths to which both Germany and Japan were willing to go to obtain strategic materials. But it also underscored the fundamental problem. Even with Axis cooperation, the quantities of uranium available to Japan remained woefully inadequate for a weapons program. As the war progressed and Allied naval forces gained dominance over both the Atlantic and Pacific, submarine transport became increasingly dangerous and unreliable. Other submarines attempting similar missions were sunk. The U-864, carrying similar cargo to Japan, was torpedoed and sunk by the British submarine HMS Venturer off the coast of Norway in February 1945, taking its entire crew and cargo to the bottom of the sea. For Japan's atomic program, the uranium shortage was a death sentence. Without sufficient raw material, all the theoretical knowledge and technical expertise in the world were useless. The scientists could design enrichment equipment. They could calculate the critical mass needed for a chain reaction. They could envision bomb designs, but without uranium ore to process, the entire effort remained purely theoretical. Strategic hesitation and bureaucratic paralysis. Beyond the technical and material challenges, Japan's atomic program suffered from something more insidious: a fundamental lack of strategic commitment from the highest levels of military and political leadership. The contrast with the American approach is illuminating. In the United States, the decision to pursue atomic weapons came after Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard wrote their famous letter to President Franklin Roosevelt in August 1939, warning that Nazi Germany might be developing nuclear weapons. This warning, combined with subsequent intelligence reports and scientific assessments, led to a decision to pursue atomic weapons with maximum urgency and essentially unlimited resources. Roosevelt authorized what became the Manhattan Project, and it received top priority for funding, personnel, and materials. The American leadership believed, or at least feared, that the first nation to develop atomic weapons would have a decisive military advantage. This fear drove a commitment to win the atomic race at any cost. When General Groves asked what resources the Manhattan Project needed, the answer was essentially, whatever it takes, and those resources were provided. In Japan, no such commitment ever materialized. Part of the problem was that Japanese scientists themselves provided sobering assessments of the timeline and resources required. When Nishina's committee met between 1942 and 1943 to evaluate the feasibility of an atomic bomb program, their conclusion was pessimistic. They reported that while an atomic bomb was theoretically possible, it would probably take at least 10 years to develop, perhaps longer. They didn't believe even the United States could produce such a weapon quickly enough to affect the outcome of the current war. This assessment had a paradoxical effect. Rather than spurring an urgent effort to begin immediately so that Japan might have atomic weapons for the next war, it led military leaders to deprioritize the project. The attitude seemed to be that if atomic weapons weren't going to be ready in time to matter for the current conflict, then resources should be focused on conventional weapons that could make an immediate difference: aircraft, ships, artillery, and ammunition. This was not an unreasonable calculation from the perspective of military planners facing immediate crises. By 1942 and 1943, Japan was fighting on multiple fronts across a vast geographic area. The Navy had suffered a catastrophic defeat at Midway. American submarines were beginning to strangle Japan's merchant shipping. The need for steel, aluminum, fuel, and ammunition was desperate and immediate, diverting scarce resources to a speculative program that might bear fruit a decade in the future must have seemed like a luxury Japan couldn't afford. There was also skepticism about whether the theoretical science could actually be transformed into practical weapons. Nuclear physics was a young field, filled with uncertainties. While scientists understood the basic principles of fission and chain reactions, the engineering challenges of building an actual bomb were enormous and largely unexplored. Many military officers trained in conventional warfare simply couldn't envision how this esoteric scientific research would translate into usable weapons. The internal rivalry between the Army and Navy further complicated matters. Each service jealously guarded its own programs and budgets, seeing the other as a competitor rather than a partner. The fact that both services launched separate atomic research programs, rather than combining their efforts into a single unified project, demonstrated this dysfunction. Resources that could have been concentrated were instead dispersed. Scientists who could have collaborated were isolated in different programs. Information that could have been shared remained siloed. There were brief moments when coordination improved. In the spring of 1944, as both the NIGO and EFGO programs struggled to make progress, the Army-Navy Technology Enforcement Committee was formed in an attempt to better coordinate nuclear weapons research. This led to a rare meeting on July 21, 1945, bringing together leaders from both programs. But by this point, it was far too late. The meeting accomplished little, and shortly afterward, the facility housing isotope separation research was destroyed, effectively ending serious atomic research efforts. The contrast with Germany is worth noting. Nazi Germany also pursued atomic research during the war, with programs led by scientists of Werner Heisenberg's caliber. Like Japan, Germany failed to produce atomic weapons, hampered by similar problems: limited resources, Allied bombing, lack of sufficient uranium, and strategic hesitation from leadership. Both Axis powers had the scientific knowledge but lacked the industrial capacity and strategic commitment to transform that knowledge into weapons before the war ended. In both cases, there was a failure of imagination and prioritization at the highest levels. Neither Adolf Hitler nor the Japanese military leadership fully grasped how transformative atomic weapons could be. They saw them as potentially powerful weapons, but not as war-winning weapons worth the massive investment required. This stands in stark contrast to the Allied leadership, particularly in the United States and Britain, who understood that atomic weapons could fundamentally change the nature of warfare and acted accordingly. Destruction rains from the sky. As 1944 turned to 1945, whatever slim hopes remained for Japan's atomic program were systematically destroyed by American bombing raids. The introduction of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress to the Pacific theater brought Japan's cities and industrial facilities within range of sustained aerial bombardment. The B-29 was a remarkable aircraft, capable of flying at high altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to intercept it, and carrying heavy bomb loads over vast distances. American strategy evolved from precision bombing of military and industrial targets to incendiary raids designed to burn Japan's largely wooden cities. The raids on Tokyo in March 1945 created firestorms that killed more people in a single night than the atomic bomb would later kill at Hiroshima. For Japan's atomic research facilities, the bombing represented a catastrophic setback. On April 13th, 1945, American B-29 bombers hit Tokyo in a raid that damaged the Riken Institute. The attack destroyed Nishina's thermal diffusion apparatus, the Clusius tube that was the centerpiece of the NIGO project's uranium enrichment efforts. Years of work were reduced to rubble in a matter of minutes. The irony was bitter. The Americans had no idea they were striking a nuclear research facility. Riken was targeted because it was a scientific and industrial facility, not because Allied intelligence knew about Japan's atomic program. The destruction was accidental from the American perspective, but it was devastating for the Japanese effort. The damage wasn't limited to equipment. The bombing raids created an environment of constant disruption. Air raid sirens interrupted work. Scientists and technicians had to take shelter. Power outages, already chronic, became even more frequent as electrical infrastructure was targeted. Transportation networks were disrupted, making it difficult to move materials and personnel. The psychological toll was enormous, as researchers worked under the constant threat of annihilation from the sky. Even if the specific facilities housing atomic research weren't intentionally targeted, the broader industrial infrastructure that any atomic program required was being systematically destroyed. Precision manufacturing facilities, chemical plants, and electrical generating stations were all high-priority targets for American bombers. Each raid further eroded Japan's already inadequate industrial capacity. In June 1945, with the Riken facility damaged and no prospect of repairing or replacing the destroyed equipment, Nishina officially declared the NIGO project over. What resources remained were nominally handed over to the Navy's FGO project, but this was largely a symbolic gesture. The FGO program at Kyoto was hardly in better shape. While Arakatsu's team had avoided direct bombing damage to their facilities, they were no closer to producing a functional ultracentrifuge than they had been when the project started. The centrifuge design existed on paper, scheduled for completion in August 1945, but with the surrender of Japan on August 15th, it would never be built. The final meeting of FGO project scientists on July 21, 1945, came too late to salvage anything. Shortly after this meeting, the facility known as Building 49, which housed what isotope separation research remained, was destroyed. Whether this was due to bombing, deliberate demolition to prevent it falling into enemy hands, or some other cause, the result was the same: the end of Japan's nuclear weapons research. Meanwhile, as Japan's program collapsed, the Manhattan Project was reaching its climax. In the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, the world's first atomic explosion lit up the pre-dawn sky at the Trinity test site. The test confirmed that the plutonium implosion design worked. Less than a month later, that design would be used to devastating effect over Nagasaki. The technological gap between the two programs had always been vast, but by the summer of 1945, it was unbridgeable. While Japan struggled to keep electricity flowing to small laboratory experiments, the United States had multiple massive industrial facilities operating around the clock, while Japanese scientists worked with milligrams of uranium separated in laboratory equipment. American facilities at Oak Ridge had produced kilograms of highly enriched uranium-235. While Japanese researchers dreamed of building functional centrifuges, American reactors at Hanford had already produced the plutonium needed for bombs. The disparity wasn't just in scale, but in organization and purpose. The Manhattan Project had a clarity of mission and command structure. Everyone involved understood the goal: build atomic bombs before Germany did, and be prepared to use them to end the war. Resources flowed to wherever they were needed. Problems were solved through coordination between scientists, engineers, and military leaders. The whole apparatus moved forward with unified purpose. Japan's effort, by contrast, had always been fragmented, under-resourced, and uncertain of its objectives. Was the goal to build a bomb for the current war or for some future conflict? Should resources go to the Army, program, or the Navy program? How could scientists justify requesting scarce materials when conventional weapons were desperately needed? These questions were never satisfactorily answered, and in the absence of clear answers, the program drifted and stagnated. The verdict of history. So how close did Japan actually come to building an atomic bomb? The historical consensus is clear and unambiguous. Japan was nowhere near producing a functional nuclear weapon. After Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, American forces launched a systematic investigation of Japanese scientific and military capabilities as part of the occupation. The Manhattan Project's atomic bomb mission deployed to Japan in September 1945, tasked with assessing exactly how far Japanese atomic research had progressed. The team included some of the same scientists and intelligence officers who had investigated German nuclear programs in Europe through the ALSOS mission. What they found confirmed that Japan's atomic efforts, while scientifically sophisticated, had never progressed beyond laboratory-scale research. Robert Furman, who had served as chief of foreign intelligence for the Manhattan Project and participated in the inspection of Japanese facilities, recounted in a 2008 interview how strikingly small the Japanese program was compared to American facilities. He noted that if Japan had mounted a serious effort comparable to the Manhattan Project, they would have needed enormous facilities like those at Oak Ridge. Instead, what the investigators found were small laboratories with modest equipment. There was no full-scale nuclear reactor capable of producing plutonium. The Japanese had theoretical understanding of reactor physics, but they had never attempted to build an actual reactor. Without a reactor, there was no pathway to plutonium production, which was the route the American Fat Man bomb had taken. There was no industrial-scale uranium enrichment plant. The thermal diffusion apparatus at Riken, before it was destroyed, was a laboratory device capable of demonstrating the principle of isotope separation, but utterly incapable of producing weapons-grade material in usable quantities. The ultracentrifuge designs for the FGO program existed only on paper. No functional centrifuges had been built, much less industrial cascades of centrifuges, like those that would later become standard in uranium enrichment. There was no finalized bomb design ready for construction. Unlike the Manhattan Project, which had developed and tested multiple bomb designs, including the gun-type Little Boy and the implosion-type Fat Man, Japanese scientists had only theoretical concepts. The physics of creating a supercritical assembly of fissile material and sustaining a chain reaction long enough to produce a nuclear explosion involved complex calculations and experimental work that the Japanese had barely begun to address. The detonation technology alone, which required precisely timed conventional explosives to compress a plutonium core, was an engineering feat that the Japanese were nowhere near achieving. Most tellingly, Japan had never enriched uranium to any significant level of purity. The entire atomic enterprise rested on the ability to separate uranium-235 from uranium-238. And despite understanding the theory and attempting multiple enrichment methods, the Japanese programs had produced negligible amounts of separated isotopes. Without enriched uranium or plutonium, there was no possibility of building a bomb, no matter how well scientists understood the theory. The Manhattan Project Intelligence Group's assessment was definitive. They reported that Japanese nuclear physicists were just as capable as those from other nations, including the United States. The failure wasn't due to lack of scientific talent or theoretical understanding. The failure was due to lack of resources, lack of industrial capacity, lack of uranium, and lack of strategic commitment from leadership. In comparison to Nazi Germany's program, which also failed to produce atomic weapons, Japan's effort was similar in outcome but different in execution. Germany had pursued reactor physics more seriously than Japan, with scientists like Werner Heisenberg making significant progress toward understanding how to sustain a controlled chain reaction. However, Germany also lacked sufficient uranium and made critical errors in their choice of moderator materials. Both Axis powers had the science, but not the means to weaponize it. There have been persistent but thoroughly debunked claims that Japan might have tested an atomic bomb near Hungnam in Korea in the final days of the war. These claims, promoted most prominently by journalist Robert K. Wilcox in his book Japan's Secret War, have been systematically refuted by historians. Walter Grunden, an historian at Bowling Green State University who has written extensively on Japanese wartime nuclear research, has comprehensively debunked these theories. The evidence for a test at Hungnam consists largely of unverified anecdotal reports from questionable sources, with no physical evidence, no documentary confirmation from Japanese sources, and no plausible explanation for how Japan could have produced fissile material for such a test when every credible piece of evidence shows they never succeeded in significant uranium enrichment. The Hungnam theory relies on a conspiracy of silence supposedly maintained by both Japanese and American authorities, but the logic collapses under scrutiny. If Japan had tested a nuclear weapon, the physical traces would be detectable even decades later through residual radiation. No such traces have been found. If Japanese scientists had achieved this breakthrough, surely some would have mentioned it in the decades after the war, when secrecy no longer mattered. None have. The theory requires us to believe that Japan somehow solved all the problems that stumped them throughout the war at the very last moment, in a facility that no contemporary records confirm existed, using uranium they never had. The truth is far simpler and more tragic. Japan's atomic program represented the aspirations of brilliant scientists working under impossible conditions. They understood what needed to be done. They knew the physics. They had the intellectual capability. What they lacked was time, resources, uranium, industrial capacity, and the unified strategic commitment that might have overcome these obstacles. In the final assessment, Japan's atomic program was a laboratory curiosity, not a weapons program. It was theoretical research that never made the crucial transition to industrial-scale production. It was scientific understanding that never became engineering capability. The ironic aftermath. The story's ending is draped in bitter irony. In August 1945, the war ended not with a Japanese atomic bomb, but with two American ones. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped the little boy uranium bomb on Hiroshima, instantly killing tens of thousands and condemning many more to slow deaths from radiation sickness. The city was chosen partly because it had been largely spared from conventional bombing raids, making it an ideal target to demonstrate the new weapon's power without the confusing effects of pre-existing damage. News of the attack reached Tokyo, but it was initially unclear what had happened. Reports spoke of a single bomb that had destroyed an entire city, but this seemed impossible, according to conventional understanding. The Japanese High Command was skeptical. Perhaps it had been a massive conventional raid with many bombers. Perhaps the reports were exaggerated? On August 7th, Yoshio Nishina was sent to Hiroshima to investigate. As one of Japan's foremost nuclear physicists, he was uniquely qualified to determine whether an atomic bomb had actually been used. Nishina examined the blast patterns, the thermal effects, the radiation signatures. He collected physical evidence and made measurements. On August 8th, he sent his confirmation back to Tokyo. Yes, this had indeed been an atomic bomb. Hiroshima had been struck by the very weapon Nishina had tried and failed to build. One can only imagine Nishina's thoughts as he surveyed the devastation. Here was the theoretical science he understood so well, transformed into a practical weapon by a nation with the resources to do what Japan could not. The destruction was comprehensive. Buildings were vaporized at ground zero. The distinctive shadows of incinerated people were burned into walls and pavement. Survivors wandered in shock, their skin hanging in strips from radiation burns. The city had become a laboratory demonstration of nuclear physics, written in human suffering. 3 days later, on August 9th, before Japan's leadership could fully process the implications of Hiroshima, a second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. This was Fat Man, the plutonium implosion device, using technology even more sophisticated than the uranium bomb. The attack killed tens of thousands more and demonstrated that America had not just one atomic bomb, but multiple weapons and the capacity to produce more. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese citizens had heard his voice. Among the reasons cited for surrender was a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. In the aftermath of surrender, American occupation forces moved quickly to dismantle Japan's military research capabilities. On October 16, 1945, Nishina requested permission to use his remaining cyclotrons for biological and medical research. The request was initially granted. After all, cyclotrons had legitimate peacetime scientific applications and had been used for medical isotope production. But on November 10th, orders came from U.S. Secretary of War Robert Patterson in Washington to destroy all Japanese cyclotrons, not just those that had been part of weapons research. The directive was comprehensive. Every cyclotron at Riken, Kyoto University, and Osaka University was to be dismantled. On November 24, 1945, American forces carried out this order. The cyclotrons that Nishina had built with such care, the first machines of their kind constructed outside the United States, were taken apart piece by piece. The electromagnets, the vacuum chambers, the delicate equipment that had taken years to construct were disassembled. Then, in a final indignity, the parts were loaded onto barges and dumped into Tokyo Bay. The destruction caused an international outcry among scientists. Nishina wrote a letter of protest, arguing that his cyclotrons had been scientific instruments with no direct connection to weapons research. He pointed out that the cyclotrons had been officially part of the NIGO project only because that designation provided funding and protected his researchers from military conscription. The machines themselves had been used for basic nuclear physics research, not weapons development. The protest from the international scientific community was significant. Many American physicists who knew Nishina's reputation as a world-class researcher were appalled that valuable scientific equipment had been destroyed. The incident created embarrassment for the U.S. occupation authorities and contributed to a re-evaluation of policies toward Japanese science. Eventually, the policy softened. Nishina was allowed to rebuild Japan's scientific infrastructure, focusing now on peaceful research. He became a leading voice for Japan's post-war scientific community and was awarded the Order of Culture by the Japanese government in 1946. Recognition of his contributions to physics despite the unfortunate association with wartime weapons research. Nishina lived until January 10, 1951, dying of liver cancer at age 60. His legacy was complex, a brilliant physicist who had helped establish Japan's nuclear physics research, but also a man who had led an ultimately futile attempt to build weapons of mass destruction. His final years were spent helping rebuild Japanese science on a peaceful foundation. Bunsaku Arakatsu lived longer, until 1973, continuing his physics research in the post-war period. Hideki Yukawa, who had been part of Arakatsu's FGO team, achieved international recognition when he won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1949 for his prediction of mesons. Yukawa's success demonstrated that Japanese physics had world-class talent, even if that talent had been misdirected during the war. The facilities in Korea that had produced small amounts of heavy water were captured by Soviet forces when the USSR entered the war against Japan in August 1945. Some have speculated about whether Soviet forces found useful nuclear research materials or information at these sites, but credible historians agree that any Japanese nuclear activities in Korea were minimal and contributed nothing significant to later Soviet or North Korean nuclear programs. The Soviet atomic bomb, successfully tested in 1949, was developed primarily through espionage that penetrated the Manhattan Project, not through captured Japanese or German research. The broader irony extends to nuclear energy itself. Today, Japan has a substantial civilian nuclear power industry, using the same physics that Nishina and Arakatsu understood for peaceful electricity generation, rather than weapons. After the Fukushima disaster in 2011, questions about nuclear safety in earthquake-prone Japan led to intense national debate. But the underlying irony remains. A nation that failed to build atomic weapons during the war became a significant user of nuclear energy for power afterward. Lessons from failure. The failure of Japan's atomic bomb program was not due to lack of intelligence, scientific sophistication, or ambition. It was the result of a confluence of factors that made success impossible given the constraints of time, resources, and circumstances. First was the resource gap. The Manhattan Project operated with essentially unlimited funding and access to America's enormous industrial capacity. Japan, fighting a multi-front war across Asia and the Pacific, could barely sustain its conventional military forces, let alone divert massive resources to speculative weapons development. Second was the uranium shortage. Without access to significant quantities of uranium ore, no amount of scientific brilliance could produce a bomb. Japan's desperate searches across occupied territories and attempts to obtain uranium from Germany came too late and yielded too little. Third was the organizational dysfunction. The rivalry between Army and Navy programs, the lack of central coordination, and the absence of unified strategic direction meant that limited resources were fragmented and dissipated rather than concentrated for maximum effect. Fourth was the strategic hesitation. Unlike the American leadership, which committed fully to atomic weapons development out of fear that Germany might develop them first, Japanese military leaders never fully believed that atomic weapons could be developed quickly enough to matter. This skepticism became a self-fulfilling prophecy, as half-hearted commitment ensured inadequate progress. Fifth was the technological gap. Even if Japan had possessed sufficient uranium and resources, the engineering challenges of building a functional bomb were immense. The Americans had to solve countless technical problems, from uranium enrichment to plutonium production to bomb design and detonation mechanisms. Each of these required massive experimental programs. Japan never progressed beyond the most preliminary stages of this technical development. Finally, there was the crushing pressure of Allied bombing. As American air power intensified, Japanese industrial facilities and research institutions were systematically destroyed. The April 1945 bombing that destroyed Nishina's thermal diffusion apparatus was emblematic of a broader problem. Japan couldn't maintain long-term research programs when its cities and factories were being reduced to rubble. The Japanese atomic program stands as a historical footnote, a what-if scenario that never came close to realization. It demonstrates that scientific knowledge alone is insufficient for technological achievement. Success requires not just understanding the physics, but having the industrial capacity to implement it, the resources to sustain it, and the strategic vision to prioritize it. In the final analysis, Japan's atomic program failed not because Japanese scientists were inferior to their American counterparts, but because Japan was an island nation with limited resources fighting a war against an industrial giant with vast natural resources, unlimited manufacturing capacity, and the security to pursue long-term research programs without fear of immediate attack on the home front. The story serves as a reminder that technological competition between nations is often decided less by scientific brilliance than by industrial capacity, resource availability, and strategic vision. The atomic age began not because American scientists were smarter than Japanese or German scientists, but because America had the industrial muscle to transform scientific theory into working weapons, and because American leadership committed to that transformation with unwavering determination. History remembers the Manhattan Project as a triumph of science and engineering, the achievement that brought the atomic age into being. But behind that achievement were thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers, billions of dollars in investment, massive industrial facilities, and years of focused effort. Japan's failed atomic program reminds us of what happens when scientific understanding exists without the industrial and organizational capacity to harness it. The atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented not just a scientific breakthrough, but the mobilization of an entire nation's industrial capacity toward a single goal. Japan's scientists understood the same physics, dreamed the same dreams, and worked with equal dedication. But understanding was not enough. In the race to build the bomb, they never had a real chance. If you found this deep dive into one of World War II's lesser-known stories compelling, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore the hidden corners of history, the stories that don't make it into most textbooks, the complex truths behind the simplified narratives. Hit that like button if this episode resonated with you, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how the war might have unfolded differently if Japan had succeeded in its atomic ambitions. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode of WW2 Tales.